Aaron Rodgers gives us an update about whether he's coming back this year, and it's pretty logical. We'll get into it today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, December 20th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Today we are going to have our weekly mailbag. Each Wednesday we try and do a mailbag show with listener questions. But before we get into that, there was some pretty big news for the New York Jets yesterday that broke where else but on the Pat McAfee show on ESPN. Aaron Rodgers does a weekly segment there. And as you may know, today is the deadline for the New York Jets to either activate Aaron Rodgers to the 53-man roster or he essentially reverts back to injured reserve for the rest of the season. So he's either going to be on the 53-man roster by the end of the day or he's done for the year. And I think that much of the suspense was taken out on Sunday when the Jets lost to Miami and were officially eliminated from the playoffs. But Rodgers did not explicitly say he's not playing, but he did everything short of that. And he even indicated that, he's not really close to being 100% at this point. He said he's 14 weeks away out of surgery. He said that there's no way to be medically cleared 100% 14 weeks after an Achilles injury. He said that he would be pushing to get back into the lineup if he was 100%. So lots of logical stuff coming from Rodgers, which I don't think you could say the way the Jets have handled this, or at least the way the Jets have handled this through the media, has been very logical. Because the Jets have been pushing this idea that Rodgers was way ahead of schedule and that, they were making it sound like he was definitely coming back this weekend. They've been doing this for months. And I know it doesn't really impact what happens on the field, but I mean, as I was watching the clips of what Rodgers said yesterday, all I could think of was like this is such a vintage Jets situation where they overpromise and underdeliver, where the Jets made it sound like, he's going to be back. No question he's going to be back. There's not going to be any risk. As we found out, they make it sound like, this was some miraculous situation where there's unprecedented. As it turns out, it's impossible to be fully healed 14 weeks off an Achilles surgery. It wasn't realistic. And but it's like the Jets. The Jets always chase these headlines. The Jets always try and stay relevant. And I was sitting there yesterday thinking, and I hope this isn't like too harsh on them, but it's like if the Jets put half as much effort into trying to build a good offensive line as they do trying to like get buzz and win the back pages and be the top story on ESPN and NFL Network, this team would be going places. It's just like such a vintage Jets move because the Jets were like feeding this to the media. I know Rodgers did his weekly show and Rodgers was playing it up, but he's Rodgers. He's going to try. He's an athlete. He's going to try and get back. The Jets organization, like they were selling this to the beat writers. They were selling this to anybody who would listen that, Rodgers is going to be back. And it was never very realistic. I mean, Rodgers has said it, like, I'm not 100%. Now, if Rodgers was 100%, even in a meaningless game, like there'd be no reason to not put him out there. But they were if he was put out there, he probably was going to be compromised. So maybe it's for the best the Jets don't still have that 1% chance of making the playoffs. Rodgers said some other things that generated some buzz. I don't think they're necessarily significant. Rodgers went out of his way to praise Joe Douglas, went out of his way to praise Robert Saleh and Nathaniel Hackett. I think that that's very boilerplate stuff. I don't think that Rodgers, giving those guys credit necessarily means anything. I think Rodgers understands his way around the media. He understands that if he says anything other than that, it's a big story. I think that Saleh, Douglas, and Hackett are all likely to return, but I don't think it's because of anything Rodgers said yesterday. I think it's just that's the way Woody Johnson operates. But I don't think that there's any significance, anything to be read into that Rodgers is praising these guys. I think that's just what you would expect from any player on any team. I mean, look at any team across the league that's struggling right now. I'm sure that unless it's just a completely toxic situation where the bottom has fallen out, you're seeing a lot of comments where players on struggling teams are praising their coaching staff, saying it's not the coaching staff's fault. And Rodgers made a lot of accurate points about fans being frustrated. Fans are always going to be angry when the team loses, and he made some pretty interesting points there, some pretty solid points. And the last thing is Rodgers mentioned that he's looking at playing 2 more seasons, and of course we don't know that. He doesn't know that right now. It's when you're 40, when you have a player who's 40 years old, it's always a year-to-year proposition. If next year goes well, who knows? Maybe Rodgers is back for 2025. If next year doesn't go well, he's on the cusp of retirement. And this is a guy who, in his own words, at one point during the last offseason was 90% of his way towards retirement. And now he's talking about, after this season, playing 2 more years after it. So, it's difficult to say, and a lot will depend on how the next season goes for the Jets. And I think we all know that he is coming back for next season. We'll see what happens going forward. So that's your Aaron Rodgers update. Rodgers sounds like it's all but done. The Jets will probably officially announce it at some point on Wednesday that he's finished for the season. I'm sure news will break at some point, and the Jets will go forward without Aaron Rodgers for the final 3 games. And then we have, I guess, 3 more games to look forward to and an off season to look forward to. But anyway, let's jump into our mailbag show. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. Our first question, John, the lack of success on such a high percentage of offensive plays is baffling to me. I remember the Jets defense foolishly bragging after their 2018 opener against the Lions that they knew most of the plays because the calls and signals did not change over year and was all on film. Could the Jets possibly be tipping their plays? Well, I mean, if you watch the Jets this year, what do you think is going to happen on first down? I don't know so much about the calls and the signals. I think everybody knows that you have a pretty good shot of a run up the middle on first down. I think the Jets are very predictable on offense. I think that they have an offensive scheme that does not really put much stress on the opponent. I mean, how many times does Nathaniel Hackett scheme guys open? What happens is sometimes like a receiver gets open because like his route takes him to a hole in the zone, and I'll see somebody on Twitter saying like, "Oh, Hackett schemed that guy open." He didn't scheme anybody open. If a receiver's route takes him to a hole in the zone, that's just the play is intended. It's nothing special. What you saw on Sunday with the Miami Dolphins was Mike McDaniel scheming guys open by using motion and getting guys, putting defenders in tough spots, putting them in leverage situations where they're not in a great spot. That's, the Jets never do any of that. Ultimately, though, I think the biggest problem with the Jets is the offensive line. I mean, that was just a horrific performance on Sunday. It was a performance that, like, I don't care if Rodgers is in there. The Jets offense is not going to do anything. I don't care who the quarterback was. Now, that was their worst performance of the season. I don't think they've been that bad through the rest of the season, but they've been really bad. And they've been so bad to the point where I think any offense would struggle to function. They've been so bad to the point where I'm almost ready to say that the offensive line has been a bigger problem than missing Rodgers. Because if you can't block anybody up front, it's very difficult to do anything. I mean, look at Breece Hall's rushing stats the last month or two. He can't get anything going on the ground, and it's not because Breece lacks explosiveness, because he's doing plenty as a receiver. They can't block anybody, and I think that's a bigger problem. At the end of the day, even if the other team knows what's coming, you still can execute. I mean, the Jets on defense, they don't really fool a lot of people. The offenses know what the Jets are doing on defense. It's just the Jets are so good that they overwhelm the opposition. So, yeah, I mean, look, they're predictable. There's no question about that. I'm sure that, there are other things, and yes, Hackett could certainly do more to help guys scheme-wise. But at the end of the day, when you can't block anybody, I think that's the bigger problem. Now, speaking of people who can't be blocked, Bryce Huff having an outstanding season. He's about to hit free agency. A great time for a contract year for Bryce Huff. Could the Jets use the franchise tag on him? Is that one possible mechanism to keep him, or at least to get something of value for him? We'll discuss as we continue on this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more or less than 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. Do you want to play with some of PrizePicks' favorite players like rapper Meek Hill and comedian Andrew Schultz? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app and view entries from some of the biggest names in the PrizePicks community each week. And this week on PrizePicks, you can pick Christian McCaffrey to have more than 75 rushing yards, Patrick Mahomes to have more than 2 passing touchdowns. And you should also know that PrizePicks offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, the player is rebooted. PrizePicks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with this injury insurance policy. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match of up to $100. Again, go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match of up to $100 using PrizePicks. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Let's continue with our mailbag show. John, do you think the Jets will franchise Bryce Huff if they cannot agree to an extension prior to free agency? Do you think they will do a tag end trade? I think it's unlikely because the Jets are very tight up against the salary cap and the projected numbers. Now, we won't know the exact numbers until the league officially announces the salary cap for 2024, but I've seen projections on overthecap.com, which is like the go-to source for salary cap news. They've got Huff, in the 20 or defensive ends in the $23-24 million range for salary cap, for a cap hit on the franchise tag. That's not really doable for the Jets. So the only way they could swing it is if they either agree to an extension really quick, and if you could do that, you wouldn't need the tag anyway, or they would need to have like a trade in place really quick. And what that would require is it would require either the new team to have $24 million ready for Huff, and that's an overpay for it. Look, I love Bryce Huff, and he'd be my top priority. You can't pay him that much. You can't pay him over $20 million. So the other option would be have an extension in place. Again, that needs to happen quickly. So, and I think like if you're a team in that situation, if you're one of the other teams, you'd say, well, the Jets can't afford to hold him at that price, so they can't tag him. So let's just let him hit free agency. Like it's kind of like a game, a game of dare with the Jets, where it's like you guys can't tag him. So why not just like wait for the Jets to let him go? I don't think that's doable. I think the only scenario where the Jets are going to be able to keep Huff based on their salary cap situation is kind of like a backloaded deal where there's a low first year cap hit and there are lots of guarantees year 2, year 3. Those are always risky, but I'll say this. If you're going to take that risk, this is the guy you do it on. 25 years old and entering his prime, and is showing he's a great fit for your team, a great fit for your locker room, and a great fit for your system. I don't love giving deals like that to guys from other teams, because when you import somebody from another team, you don't know whether he's going to fit your system. You don't know whether he's going to be as good as he was in his other surroundings. Huff, works with the Jets. You know that he's a great fit for this team. So I would not have a huge objection to that as long as the money did not get crazy. But I think the tag's just too big to do it. And I think that any other team like looking at this is saying like, well, why should I try and work out a trade with the Jets? I know they can't keep him on that tag. So just say, you Jets, you can't tag him. We're not going to work out a trade with you. So I think it would be tough to do the tag on Huff. I think that it's probably not going to happen. Next question. What's the harm in firing Hackett? Is it upsetting Rodgers? If he throws a tantrum and retires, would that not help the Jets cap space and start the rebuild? Look, I don't think Hackett should be around. And, something, I think the Jets have been too deferential to Rodgers. And it's really come back to bite them, especially when you look. I mean, the 3 moves that were really hurt the Jets. 1, Allen Lazard. 2, Randall Cobb. And 3, Hackett. And, Hackett was brought in before. Hackett was like kind of brought in to help lure Rodgers to the Jets. So I don't know how much you can blame Rodgers for that one. You could blame him for Lazard. You certainly could blame him for Cobb, because those are 2 of the Jets' top 3 receivers this year, and those were handpicked guys by Rodgers. They've been overly deferential to him. And if you want to say, why don't blame Rodgers, blame the Jets for catering to him to so much, I can't argue with that. And that needs to end. And the first way it ends is Hackett's got to go. I don't think he should come back. I'm sorry, but I understand, like, you want your quarterback to, like, have a good rapport with his offensive coordinator. You want somebody he works with well. But Hackett's shown he's not a good coordinator. And, Rodgers can say all he wants. So I won 2 MVPs in this system with Hackett. Well, you know what? You've won MVPs with other coordinators too. It's not the system that won you the MVPs. It's you that won the MVPs. So, and the other thing is, this year has shown you the flaws in having Hackett around. Yeah, fine. I'm sure the offense would be better if Rodgers was under center. But if your offense only works when Aaron Rodgers is under center, it's probably not a very good offense, because any offense is going to work with Aaron Rodgers under center. So I think that's just one of the things where Rodgers alone might be worth having, but Rodgers, if it comes with Hackett and Lazard and Cobb and Billy Turner, he's probably, at some point it's not worth doing. So if Rodgers retires, then Rodgers retires. It would hurt. It actually would hurt the Jets cap wise, and here's why. So the Jets are off. If Rodgers retires, Jets are off the hook for any 2024 charges, but his cap number this year is only like 8.88 million. And his salary, if you count all the bonuses or something like that, is like around the 37.5 million. So that's around 30 million that has not been charged to the Jets cap that they've paid Rodgers. And ultimately, like you hear about these cap machinations and how teams move money around. In the long run, you're charged as much as you pay a player. Now, again, the Jets are paying Rodgers $37 million this year. They're only charged for $8-9 million against the cap. The rest of the money will eventually be charged to the Jets cap. And if Rodgers retires, the rest of it is due immediately. So you're talking about a $30 million cap hit now. Depending on how things go, you could maybe split that over 2 seasons, depending on the timing of Rodgers' retirement. So it actually would not necessarily be beneficial for the Jets cap, but you also are taking you're also taking the $37.5 million next year off the table. So the Jets won't need to pay that in the future. So a bit complicated. In the short run, it actually would hurt their cap. In the long run, they'd be off the hook for $37.5 million. But also next year, without Rodgers around, the team's probably not going to be very good. That may be true with Rodgers anyway. So I guess there's a lot to be debated as far as whether it's better for the Jets for Rodgers to return. But one thing I can tell you is that I don't think the Jets should cater to Rodgers when it comes to Hackett. I think Hackett's shown that he just does not belong here. And you know what? If Rodgers doesn't like it, then Rodgers doesn't like it. But the Jets, I don't think, can go forward like this. I think that this is just a situation that's reached a breaking point. And speaking of things that have reached a breaking point, Jets offensive line. I mentioned it. It might be a bigger problem with the team than Rodgers missing games this year. It's been that bad. How did the Jets fix it this offseason? Easier said than done. We'll go into the options at the Jets' disposal as we continue this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. You should not have to worry when you're buying tickets to your next big event. Gametime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. And with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Gametime takes all the guesswork out of buying tickets. This Sunday, the Jets play the Washington Commanders. Late season game. Not a lot on the line for both teams, but it can be fun to go. My first Jets game ever when I was a kid was in Rich Kotite's second season. I went to a game. My uncle took me Thanksgiving weekend. They were playing the Houston Oilers. It was still fun, even in a lost Jets season. So check out the tickets available for this game on Gametime. It could be a nice Christmas gift for somebody, even when the Jets aren't playing that well. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space, for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Wednesday. We continue now with our weekly mailbag show. Our next question is about the offensive line, and this is a tough question to answer for the New York Jets. What are the options for building the line in 2024? Becton's gone, Laken Tomlinson's gone or stays on a big pay cut. Dwayne Brown's gone, leaving AVT and Tippmann. How can the Jets get a tolerable offensive line for Aaron Rodgers in 2024? I hear a lot of Jets fans citing the Kansas City Chiefs a couple of years ago. You may remember in the Super Bowl after the 2020 season, Tampa Bay dominating Kansas City, Patrick Mahomes being under constant duress, and the Chiefs went out that offseason and rebuilt their offensive line completely. That's an outlier. Like half the NFL tries to fix their offensive line every year, and they don't do it as well as Kansas City did. Look, it would be great if the Jets can do it. Jets are going to have to try and do it, but this stuff's easier said than done. It's easy to talk about rebuilding an offensive line. Well, what have the Jets been trying to do the last decade? They've been trying to fix especially the last 5 years. They've put a lot of resources into trying to fix their offensive line. It was that easy; it would already be done. They probably will need 2 new tackles. Dwayne Brown's gone. Becton should not be back. I mean, Becton's become one of the worst tackles in the NFL. I would not even consider bringing Becton back as a starter next season. So what do? There aren't a lot of great free agent options. I keep seeing the other thing I keep saying is, well, just draft somebody and sign a free agent. Well, there aren't really a lot of great free agent options. I mean, you've got Trent Brown from New England, Tyron Smith, Jonah Williams. I mean, the first three guys I mentioned are in their 30s. Or the first two guys I mentioned are in their 30s. And none of these options are really that great. I mean, George Fant's available, Donovan Smith. I think you're just going to have to roll the dice on some mediocre free agent at one spot and hope that they pan out. Hope somebody has a career year. George Fant had a great year for the Jets in 2021. He's having another solid year for Houston. I'm not saying you bring Fant back, but I'm saying I think you're just going to have to take somebody of that caliber and just hope that they have an outlier season. And that's not a great thing to bet on. But sign a free agent. Well, who's available? There aren't really a lot of great free agents available along the offensive line. Now, one option that is at the Jets' disposal, they're probably going to have a pretty high first-round pick, and this is viewed as a pretty good tackle year in the draft. So maybe that's an option. But again, let's not overstate how likely it is. Now, in the top of the first round, there's a chance that you get somebody who's plug and play, who's ready to go in. But look at the tackles this year. This year, 2023 was supposed to be a pretty decent tackle class. None of the guys for this are playing that great as rookies. You look the last couple of years, there's not a lot of rookie tackles who enter the league and play great football. Is it possible for the Jets to fix this offensive line this offseason? Yeah, sure. Is it likely that this is going to be a great offensive line next year? Probably not. Is it going to be tough to get it to even passable? It's doable, but not a slam dunk. I think that's probably your best bet if you're looking for something. Sign one of these mid-tier free agents and hope they pan out, and then draft a guy high and hope he pans out. It's tough when you don't have a second-round pick. That could be another spot to help fortify the offensive line if the Jets had it, but they don't. I mean, is Laken Tomlinson gone on the merits? He probably should be, but there's a lot of dead money. Jets save some money, but it's like $10 million in dead money, and who do you get to replace him? These aren't easy questions. It's not easy to build an offensive line in today's NFL. There is a scarcity of quality offensive linemen. And yeah, I know you can say the Jets are going to try and build it. The Jets are going to throw resources at it, but so are a lot of other teams. It's not going to be that easy. Next question, John. The Jets have been rebuilding since 2012 when the Tim Tebow season ended. Since then, we've seen the Chiefs, Bills, Dolphins, Browns, Jaguars, Rams, Bengals, Texans, 49ers, and Lions all successfully rebuild while the Jets are still rebuilding and hold the longest playoff drought in professional sports. Why does each rebuild constantly fall short, and what should be done to increase the success of the current rebuild? Well, there's no easy answer. I mean, the common thread is ownership. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see where ownership has led the Jets astray here. They constantly are meddling in affairs. They're constantly putting mandates on the people running the team to do things. I mean, let's look at, the end of the 2012 season, the Jets fire Mike Tannenbaum and then demand that any GM who takes over needs to keep Rex Ryan as their head coach. It's one thing if you hire somebody and that guy says, you know what, I really like Rex. That's my guy. I'm sticking. That's one thing. The Jets did not do that. The Jets said, no matter what you think about Rex, you have to stick with him. And how did the Jets end up with someone like John Idzik? Well, it's because better guys aren't going to take those conditions. And that's what happened during that search. And Idzik, I actually feel like Idzik maybe takes too much grief from the standpoint that he's a very respected guy in the NFL. He does his job effectively. When he does his current job effectively, he does the things he's good at. He was not built to be the GM of this team in this market in that situation. He was not the kind of guy who was going to come in and make the drastic changes needed for the Jets. He's very good at the administrative work. He's good at being kind of an assistant GM, but he's not a great GM. And that brings me to the second issue. They just hire the wrong people. And why do they hire the wrong people? Well, they don't really know what they're doing. Idzik was hired when they brought in the search firm. Woody Johnson still didn't know what he was doing, so he leaned on Charlie Casserly and Ron Wolf the next time and got a Casserly protege and Mike McCagnon. Adam Gase ran the last Jets GM search that ended up hiring Joe Douglas. Mike McCagnon ran the search that ended up with Adam Gase. I mean, they don't have good people. They don't know what they're doing, so they have to lean on people who really aren't that great when they run these searches, and they end up with bad candidates who are being hired. And the other thing is, as much as we may talk about the Jets rebuilding, I actually question the extent to which the Jets have been rebuilding for a decade because they've never really committed to it. I think Idzik was kind of trying to do it and they pulled the plug on him after 2 years, which I can't argue with the move, but They weren't rebuilding under Idzik. Maccagnan, it was always just like throwing a lot. It was always this short-term fix. It was always throwing a ton of money at the situation. Really, the only time in the last decade where it felt like they were really leaning into a rebuild was like after 2020 when Douglas brought in Robert Saleh. And at that point, the Jets, they went really young. In 2021, they just decided they were going to go with a bunch of young guys. They were acquiring as many draft picks as they could. And then like 2 years into that, they pulled the plug and they essentially brought in Rodgers, and they brought in all of Rodgers' friends, and they created a lot of dead money. Like they essentially cut out on the plan after 2 years. That rebuild plan. Like the Jets were actually, I think they were actually moving in the right direction last season, where they had all this young talent, and they had, and it felt like they were winning games. It felt like they were building something. I mean, it was 13 months ago that the Jets beat the Buffalo Bills to go to 6-3. They had both eventual rookies of the year on their team. It felt like they were finally turning the corner, and then they just went away from the plan. They essentially threw the plan out the window to bring in Rodgers and all of and not just Rodgers, but one thing if you trade for Rodgers is like a short-term like bridge quarterback, but they brought in, they essentially turned the franchise over to Rodgers. They brought in all of Rodgers' friends who haven't been producing, and essentially like we went away from what was working, the steady build. There's never been an attempt to really build this thing with a long-term focus. And the one time they tried it, they went away from it very quickly. And that ultimately, I think it all falls back on ownership. I think all of these things that I mentioned, the root cause is just they don't have good owners. So, hopefully hopefully his ownership figures it out, or hopefully they sell the team soon. That's my answer for you. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening to let you know if you missed an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out. It helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.